Hey everyone, so I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to quickly introduce you to one of my favorite books, A Visit from the Goon Squad. Hopefully, you're not watching this until after reading the first section that I asked you to read. That is the A side. I'll be actually kind of curious. Here's an extra prompt related to our reading. If you have any theories about why she's called it the A side and the B side, would love to hear your insights on that. But this is a really fascinating book to me. I have read this book probably more times than any other book that I own or have ever read. And I find something new in it every time. I think one of the great curiosities I have, I referenced this a little bit in last week's video about novels versus short story collections, is depending on your edition, I have the fun one. This is definitely the better cover than the blue guitar. Sorry if that's the one you've got. It's identified as a novel. But Jennifer Egan, in a number of interviews, has herself said that she's not really sure what she wrote. That she started with the very first story / chapter that we've got, Found Objects, and wrote about Benny Salazar, the boss who sprays pesticide in his armpits and consumes gold flakes, and decided she was interested in that character. So she then wrote The Gold Cure, and then she kind of spun this out into more and more stories. So it really started as short stories that kind of then became this larger universe. And one thing we can do if we want, by the time we finish reading this, is you can try to track and figure out the actual sequence chronologically of these stories. I will be curious as to why you think she's organized it the way that she has. One thing we can talk about, if this is of interest to folks, is when you're writing a collection of stories, whether they are interconnected or not, is how do you decide the sequence? There are some sort of, I don't want to say industry standards, but ways that people tend to organize short story collections. But I do think that thinking about that ends up being a little different when they are linked in some way or connected in some way. And so I think one of the things that I find particularly interested in this is how she's chosen to structure the collection / the novel as a whole, but also how she's made choices for how she has written stories in slightly different styles throughout, while maintaining what feels like a similarity amongst them in terms of her style. And we can talk, if you want, in the discussion board about how she does or doesn't do that, and whether that makes this feel like a short story collection or not. I'll lead by just saying a few things, and you are welcome to offer insights that say similar things. She's doing some interesting things as it relates to the passage of time, sort of the inevitability of time's flow and passage. And you might think about why she chooses the music industry as another thing that goes along with that. And then also thinking about what is going on in each story individually, thematically, as well as how you're seeing that come to fruition or come to life across stories or not. Is there something different that you experience as a reader by virtue of reading a single story in isolation versus several stories together? For example, what would it have been like to read The Gold Cure or Safari on its own without and or before having read any of the others? Because that's actually partially what my experience was. The first thing that I ever read from this book was I read the story Safari on its own in a Best American Short Stories 2009 or something like that, and didn't know that it was connected to any other stories whatsoever. And then I started reading this book and got to the chapter Safari, the story Safari, and went, well, wait a minute, hang on, this is very familiar. So I had a very different reading experience of that story in isolation versus when I read it as the fourth chapter or the fourth story in this book. So I'm just kind of curious about those sorts of things, and how the reading experience maybe becomes different when you're reading these in sequence with one another versus on their own. So those are all sorts of things that you can explore in your discussion board posts, but anything else that you want to observe or that you take away from this, both as individual artistry, but also the idea of writing stories that end up being linked to one another. So looking forward to seeing what you think. And I will, of course, be participating as well, to share my thoughts based on your thoughts. So enjoy discussing.